The Soviet Union, once a global superpower, dissolved in 1991, marking the end of the Cold War and reshaping the modern world. But what if history had taken a different turn? What if the USSR had never collapsed? How would the world look today? For the Soviet Union to survive, its biggest internal crises would have to be avoided. The economic stagnation of the 1980s would need to be addressed, either through controlled reforms or a harsher crackdown on dissent. If Gorbachev's reforms were scrapped, the Soviet government would have tightened its grip instead. Any movements pushing for independence in Eastern Europe and Soviet republics would have been crushed by the military, keeping the USSR from falling apart. Instead of slowly collapsing, the Soviet Union would have remained a strong and strictly controlled empire. The West, which thought the USSR was weakening, would have been stuck in a never-ending Cold War. This could have meant more conflicts, an arms race, and a world living in constant fear of war. Without its collapse, the USSR would remain a global superpower, locked in a bipolar struggle with the United States. The world would still be divided into two spheres, the capitalist West and the communist East. Countries in Eastern Europe, from Poland to East Germany, would remain under strict Soviet control, their economies stagnating under the weight of centralized planning. The Iron Curtain would never have lifted, and the Berlin Wall might still stand, a symbol of an unbroken ideological divide. In this alternate reality, NATO and the Warsaw Pact would continue their tense rivalry. The Soviet economy, while avoiding complete collapse, would not thrive. Instead, it would be roughly as influential as modern Russia, but spread over a much larger and more demanding territory. The planned economy would struggle to keep pace with Western technological advancements. The people of the USSR and its satellite states would continue living under a surveillance state, with political repression ensuring absolute obedience to communist rule. Dissent would be crushed, and the dream of democracy in Eastern Europe would remain an illusion. The Cold War, far from ending in 1991, would rage on. Proxy wars would continue across the globe, with the USSR and the United States funding opposing sides in conflicts from Latin America to Africa and Asia. The Soviet Union, still obsessed with spreading its ideology, would keep supporting revolutionary movements worldwide. The United States, in turn, would back right-wing military regimes and anti-communist forces, leading to an even more divided and militarized world. Afghanistan, having been a battleground for Soviet intervention in the 1980s, might remain under Soviet occupation or see an even bloodier insurgency, potentially turning into an endless quagmire like Vietnam. Without the dissolution of the USSR, Russia's modern resurgence under capitalism would never have occurred. Instead of a country adapting to global markets, it would be a state-controlled empire, forcing its citizens into a rigid economic structure. Innovation in fields like computing, medicine, and space exploration would be driven primarily by military needs, rather than civilian progress. The internet as we know it might never have flourished, as strict Soviet censorship would have limited the flow of information worldwide. The geopolitical alliances we see today would be vastly different. The European Union, without the fall of communism, might never have expanded eastward. Instead of cooperation between former Soviet states and the West, there would be constant tension and militarization at the borders. The United States, still facing an existential communist threat, would continue its heavy military spending, leading to a world where war was always a possibility. The nuclear arms race would be prolonged indefinitely. Without arms reduction treaties like START, both the USSR and the US would stockpile even greater arsenals of weapons capable of ending human civilization. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction would remain the defining principle of global security, with doomsday scenarios a daily concern. Underground bunkers, air raid drills, and paranoia over nuclear annihilation would be everyday realities. In Eastern Europe, life under Soviet rule would mean economic stagnation, heavy surveillance, and limited freedoms. Countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, which in our timeline embraced democracy and capitalism, would remain locked under Soviet-style authoritarianism. Citizens would continue to rely on rationed goods, outdated infrastructure, and state-controlled media that painted a false picture of prosperity. The arts, intellectual movements, and political discourse would be tightly controlled, with any dissent met with imprisonment or worse. The concept of free speech, democratic elections, and market-driven economies would be completely alien to those living under Soviet influence. China, another communist powerhouse, might have had a different trajectory in this scenario. With the USSR still intact, The Sino-Soviet split might have either deepened or been resolved through renewed diplomatic efforts. A unified communist bloc between the USSR and China would create an even stronger challenge to Western hegemony, potentially altering the balance of power in Asia. If tensions between the two nations remained, China might have sought to distance itself even further from Soviet influence, accelerating its own path to a more market-oriented economy. Either way, the geopolitical landscape would be even more complex than it is today. The fate of the world in this alternate history is one of prolonged division, oppression, and fear. The dream of democracy in Eastern Europe would be crushed. The world would be locked in an ideological battle with no resolution in sight. Science and technology would advance, but only within the framework of military necessity. And the nuclear threat, which has since faded from everyday consciousness, would remain an ever-present shadow over humanity. Culturally, the impact would be immense. Without the dissolution of the USSR, Russian literature, cinema, and art would continue to exist under state censorship. The West, instead of experiencing a cultural exchange with post-Soviet states, would remain largely separated from Eastern influences. The impact of Soviet defectors and émigrés on Western science, literature, and philosophy would be limited. Popular culture would reflect the ongoing struggle, with Hollywood producing even more Cold War-themed movies and literature focusing on espionage, propaganda, and the struggle between communism and capitalism. The global economy would also be affected. Without the influx of former Soviet states into global markets, trade networks would look vastly different. Russia, instead of becoming a major exporter of oil and gas under capitalist reforms, would likely maintain state control over its resources, prioritizing its own geopolitical interests over economic growth. The sanctions, trade wars, and economic blockades that characterized the Cold War would still shape international relations, leading to a less interconnected and more hostile world. Ultimately, history took a different path. The USSR collapsed, the Cold War ended, and the world moved forward imperfectly, but with hope for a better future. The dissolution of the Soviet Union allowed for the expansion of democracy, the growth of global trade, and the relative de-escalation of nuclear tensions. This alternate reality serves as a reminder that global conflicts, if left unresolved, can shape the fate of humanity for generations. The Cold War may have ended, but its lessons remain. Power unchecked leads to oppression, and ideological divides, if left to fester, can bring the world to the brink of destruction.